Human beings have always lived on Earth. Our planet has influenced and shaped our ways of life throughout human history. Until very recently, we could not even imagine not living on this planet, on Mother Earth. This should make us reflect on our relationship with the land we live on, the planet that has nurtured us since birth and will continue to provide for most of our needs until our bodies return to its soil. Planet Earth is billions of years old, and geologists divide its lifetime into different timescales based on significant changes it has experienced. The latest timescale, or epoch, is called the Holocene, which began 11,700 years ago after the last major ice age. However, in the year 2000, scientist Paul Crutzen suggested that human influence on the planet's climate and ecosystems has been so significant that we need to define a new epoch to describe this new phase of Earth's history. He called this new epoch the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is still an unofficial term, as the International Union of Geological Sciences, which is responsible for defining and naming geological epochs, has not yet accepted it as a new epoch. However, the very suggestion that we may have influenced the planet so profoundly that we need a new name to describe this paradigm shift shows that we must take this issue seriously. Threads has invited a geologist, an environmental historian, and a philosopher to discuss the Anthropocene from a multidisciplinary perspective and to explore our relationship with planet Earth. How has it evolved throughout human history? What does it look like now? And how can we reimagine this relationship for a better future?
So, about a year ago, geologists decided that the Anthropocene is not the current epoch. I guess we should try and discuss what is the Anthropocene, why this question even exists, and why it was officially turned down. Yeah. So, what is the Anthropocene?
Well, I should say that the Anthropocene represents different things to different people. And in a way, that sort of idea of going through the normal procedures to have it as an official subdivision of geologic time was just one approach. In the end, it didn't work. It was voted that it's not going to qualify as an official subdivision. But I don't think that the official decision matters that much, because what I think is kind of important is that the notion of Anthropocene was put forward. So now that's a topic of a discussion, and it's not going to go away because of that decision of the Commission of the Geological Union, the Union of Geological Sciences, which is the one responsible for that.
So the Anthropocene is basically the idea that humans are now a planetary force. Yes. And changing the planet at a scale that will be seen in the geological record in the distant future. But it's always been this interdisciplinary idea, because it's the scientist who proposed it 25 years ago, Paul Crutzen, wasn't a geologist. So it's always had this interesting dynamic where it came out of climate science and earth system science. It was taken up by historians and geographers and economists and all kinds of other disciplines, but it was sort of awkwardly up to the geologists to decide whether it fit within their official framework.
Yeah, which kind of restricted the term in a way, because it's something that, as you say, is something that's multidisciplinary. And maybe that's part of the challenge, because the way our strategies to do scientific research is kind of compartmentalized into different research areas. So we are having a hard time to work at the scale of different disciplines operating at the same time.
Yeah, so one of the debates that came up with the Anthropocene is when the Anthropocene might have started, and there was a few different proposals. Some people suggested that actually the entire Holocene has been the Anthropocene, because humans developed agriculture early in the Holocene, and that began changing ecosystems at first at a regional, but eventually at a global scale. The early use of coal as the first fossil fuel that allowed England to begin with, and then many other countries around the world, to escape ecological limits, to have an economy just keeps growing and growing, a population that just keeps growing and growing. And then there was the proposal for the mid-20th century, where if you look at all kinds of measurements, from CO2 emissions to the amount of fish that we're harvesting out of the oceans, to the amount of cows that we're raising, everything just starts to explode with population growth, economic growth. And so, which one of those do you choose? Some of them make more sense if you're looking for a golden spike over the human era, where humans have become this dominant species and have increasingly changed the environment, but that scale, the speed and the size of the change has been really ratcheting up for the past maybe 500 years, but in an exponential way, that it just keeps ratcheting up, so that in the past 60, 70 years, it's much, much faster than in the year 1700 or 1800.
So when you think about 500 years back, so Crutzen, for example, proposed that we put the limit, the start of the Anthropocene with the development of the steam engine, for example, in the 1800s. So what do you have in mind? So
the problem is, he wasn't a historian, and just as he was making that argument, most economic historians had decided the Industrial Revolution didn't start in the 1760s with the Watt steam engine. We're more inclined to see a longer, more drawn-out process. And I think the key thing is that turn to coal. It's sort of a long, slow period that I date starting around 500 years ago. And then, of course, that's also when the Europeans are sailing around the world. And I think globalization is the other side of that coin. Coal, and then also accessing different kinds of resources from all around the world. So those two things are happening in the same centuries. And I think there's a big snowball effect where they're both playing off each other. And then if we think of where we are today, this Anthropocene, it's a story of globalization, it's a story of climate change, it's people and plants moving around the world, relying on these resources from all over the world. And the only problem now is that we can't keep finding escapes for ecological limits, because it's now happening at this planetary scale. Instead of England growing and being able to rely on surplus from other places, now everywhere is growing, or just about.
Yeah, and that's a very important point, the issue of globalization, because from the perspective of finding the precise timing of that change into the Anthropocene, from the Holocene to the Anthropocene, if we follow that approach, you need to find a signal that is global. And that's also a problem at the scale of deep time, because we know that evolutionary innovations didn't take place in all environments at the same time, or in all continents at the same time. So some evolutionary innovations started in shallow marine environments, then they move into deeper water or into the continents, and that has taken millions and millions of years. So here we also have this situation that not all these events were taking place everywhere at the same time, but there is this snowball effect that is helping to propagate that. And well, one of the potential candidates was to go to the mid-40s and think, okay, the first atomic trials, that's leaving a signal in radioactive material that you may find in sediment everywhere that you go. And that may have been a potential golden spike to actually pinpoint the timing of the onset of the Anthropocene.
So, I don't know if this is a question for the geologist or the philosopher, but when did humans start thinking about planetary scale change? This is another interesting aspect of the story, that as the economy was growing, as we were turning to coal and overseas resources to have Western Europe flourish, we are also out there identifying lines in rock and connecting all kinds of different scientific discoveries in the 19th and 20th century, that all of a sudden we knew that climate had changed in the past, that it hadn't been stable across the long history, we started to learn just how old the Earth was. Yes. So how does that just sort of fundamentally change humans' understanding of its place in nature? I guess that is a philosophy question alongside a geology question.
A nice one and a big one. I mean, one of the core assumptions historically behind history is that, well, the reason why we can do history is because when we do history, we access the experience of other humans like us who have the same kind of experience, right? And so then we can look at what they wrote about what they did and try to reimagine what life for them was. And so then the experiential core, right, of past humans is what we access when we try to piece back together their history. But when we're talking about the Anthropocene, we're looking at deep history, the deep history of the human species. And so that calls to the fore a perspective about ourselves that we haven't thought about, that we find very difficult very often to think about, that we're working out new ways of looking at, right? And so we're still very much in the dark about how to integrate that in our understanding of who we are, right? So think about, humans in 200 years and so on. So if we're looking back at this moment, and we don't know what that looks like, but I imagine that recording our sense of being destabilized by this new reality would be a significant part of our experience and trying to grapple with it so that we can come up with something that, from our perspective, looks like a plan, right? And we can think, therefore, that we're doing what we need to do to live up to this new challenge, right? And this is what I think we're struggling with. Everywhere you look, you see people struggling with this, but it seems that it's very difficult to come up with something that looks like a plan behind which we can all gather, right? In which we can all recognize ourselves. So I think that is perhaps one of the very significant changes.
And it's also changing our way as scientists to do certain things. For example, in geology, one of the classic principles is the present is the key to the past. So whenever we go back in time and we try to understand past events, we always have the present as a kind of template for comparison. But through the years, we have realized that sometimes in the past, things were very different. So we started to talk about the past as a key to the present. We can use the past to understand things that are going on. And I think that there is a twist to this story now, which is the past as a key to the future. And one of the ways this has been done is by trying to go back in time and thinking at which moments of geological history there may be some potential scenarios that may work as analogs for the trajectories of the Earth system into the Anthropocene. So one that you can do is you go back 5 million of years ago. There was a time in which, the temperature increased between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius, which is what you may think will be the best case scenario if we follow we are able to put in place all the regulations that we need to put in place right now. There is a much more pessimistic scenario, which is if you go back in time 15 million years ago, there was another episode in which the temperatures probably were 7 to 8 degrees warmer than what is right now. So then, if you go even 50 million years back in time, there is a time that was actually extremely warm. Some of the estimations indicate probably 13 degrees Celsius higher than the present times. So one of the things that some geologists and paleontologists are doing, they try to look at the rocks of that age to see those different ages, to try to see what happened, which were the changes. For example, we know that 50 million years ago, because of that increase in temperature, there were much more problems for water circulation. So you can see layers that were formed under very little oxygen, and that would have been actually quite detrimental for life in the oceans. So it's almost like this is forcing us to think in new ways about the challenges of the Anthropocene. And we can use that information, which is really very back in time, to understand which are the potential scenarios that we have ahead of us.
Yeah, historians have been doing something similar. So there's been a lot of work on the Little Ice Age in the late medieval and early modern period to see how past societies dealt with a change, a much smaller change in the climate, and a climate that got colder instead of warmer.
Yes.
But it's been useful because Dagmar de Groot in particular has looked at how sometimes it was better. For the Dutch Republic, they flourished during the Little Ice Age. So it helps us to not just have that one narrative of catastrophe. It's not to downplay the possibilities of what we're facing with a 2 to 3 degree change in the next half century. But it just puts a bit of a pause. It forces us to think about the different possibilities. And then another thing that we can look at is just other time periods of incredible disruption. So we can go back to the early Industrial Revolution, where whole sectors of the economy were thrown out of work. If you were a hand loom weaver and all of a sudden cloth is being made by machines, you lost your job and were thrown into poverty. And so it's an opportunity to go and kind of learn, like, what are some of the challenges that society dealt with? Is there things we could prepare for now as we see a future where there's going to be a lot of that dislocation in some sectors of the economy? If things go as well as possible and we address climate change in fairly successful ways, we still know there's going to be incredible dislocation. Some regions are going to go into decline, others are going to benefit. But I think if we were realistic, we always knew that there was going to be ups and downs in this process, and going to history and probably going to philosophy, to sociology, political studies, the social sciences and humanities helps us think through that very bumpy path that we're going to live through, whether we like it or not. Yeah. And hopefully at least recognize that, well, the possibility of catastrophe is on the table. It's not the only possibility in our future. And we've watched technology advance at a remarkable speed in the past 20 years. It doesn't mean that we've solved climate change through technology, but I think there's like kernels of hope along with pathways of destruction. And the scale of the science that you were just talking about, the international cooperation that's happening, the innovation that's happening, it's good to bring some of that to the fore, even as we worry. I think most academics involved in this field, whether historians or scientists or social scientists, are worried about the current slow pace. Yeah. But I think it's really important to also recognize that that doesn't mean that like the future is determined by the present. There's still a spectrum of possibilities in front of us, and every action we take now makes the future a little bit easier. Every bit of inaction makes the future a little bit harder, and it's that spectrum that's useful to think about.
And I think it's hard. Probably one of the biggest challenges is to keep that balance. On one hand, we have the idea, okay, it's business as usual. It's going to be fine anyway, which is a problem. And the other is, the situation is so terrible that nothing can be done. So we have to find that sort of balance. And from certain perspective, as you were saying, the timing is good in the sense that now we have this capacity of networking to work at the global scale that wasn't in place half a century ago. In political terms, it's not the right term, because I think it's not the right time, because I think it's happening after more or less 50 years of neoliberal policies that are telling us that whatever is public is wrong and the market is going to solve everything. And we know that in this case, the market is not going to do that. So some things the scenarios are good, some others are quite not that good.
Yeah, I think we're, in general, not very good at imagining alternatives.
Yeah.
I think we tend to very easily find ourselves in narrow paths. We're used to thinking in certain ways, and then breaking through these ways of thinking and understanding ourselves can be challenging. That can be the source of some challenge, and it's also about being geared up intellectually in a way that's appropriate to the sort of challenge that we're facing. So that's one of the things that has been happening in philosophy, trying to think about the sort of grammar, the concepts that we need to actually think about this challenge. And that involves a lot of criticism of the sort of views that we had took for granted about what it means to be, for example, I'll give you an example, the concept of agent. Well, so in the last 200-300 years, for example, the concept of agent has been defined around a specific view about autonomy, making decisions, the ability to make decisions. And so when we come and say, well, what it means to be an agent now is also being part of this process whereby humans transform, the planet at an alarming scale. Well, then it's difficult because it creates this kind of dissonance between, on a day-to-day basis, what it means to be an agent, and on a larger scale, what it actually means to be an agent. And so trying to work to get these other scales registered in our simple day-to-day way of thinking about ourselves is going to be, I think, very important. Right? And that could yield very immediate, very simple kinds of changes about our behavior and how we interact. And how we view the public, for example.
Yeah. Right. And how we address some paradoxes that are associated with Anthropocene. I was thinking about this Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, the paradox of the Anthropocene. That at the same, it's very ironic that at the same time that we are realizing our limitation as a species, it's when we are actually becoming aware of how we can actually affect it, the balance in the Earth system, in our planet system, which is a big irony.
Yes.